Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Steve Cox, who's VP of Business Development at Kaman Alkon. And today we're going to talk about transforming the construction materials supply chain. Now, if you take a moment and you stop and you just look around, you see that the supply chain, the construction industry supply chain is really all around us, right? It's on the roads that we drive on and the sidewalks that we walk on. It's in our houses, it's in the buildings that we work in, and it's in all sorts of infrastructure projects that are happening all around us when you pay attention. But if you kind of take a closer look behind the scenes at how this supply chain works, you realize that there's a lot of waste and inefficiency in the supply chain. So simply put, there's probably no other supply chain that's in more dire need of transformation than the construction industry, heavy building materials industry supply chain. Now, why is that? What are some of the challenges and opportunities out there? And how can companies get started on this transformation process? Well, those are some of the questions we're going to kind of address today. And it's great to have Steve on the program to share his insights and perspective, having been in the industry for a while and on the front lines of all of this with a lot of the companies that he works with. So, Steve, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, Steve, we've had a couple of your colleagues there at Kaman Alkon on Talking Logistics, but this is your first time. And like I always like to do whenever I bring on a new guest, before we dive into the topic, I'm always curious, their career journey, and how and why they got involved with this industry and kind of what their current roles and responsibilities are. So why don't we briefly start there? Tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this industry and what your role and responsibilities are there at Kaman Alkon.
Sure, Adrian. I'm a long-term industry guy. I guess I tend to think of myself as a construction guy. I started way back in the day as a civil engineer, undergraduate. And to kind of put that on a time frame for you, it was before Windows, probably even before floppy disks. So been around a while. I've spent my career providing solutions to the construction supply chain, whether that's working with engineers on specifications, contractors on the execution side. And honestly, most of my career has really been working with the heavy building materials suppliers, the folks who provide things like concrete and asphalt and aggregates to the construction industry. My role at Kaman, I'm not sure how many of your listeners are aware of Kaman, but we're a leading provider of digital technologies to that aforementioned heavy building materials segment of the construction industry. And really right now I'm focused on, as the title implies, business development. And that's really more about thinking about where our company goes moving forward. So traditionally we've been focused on the segments mentioned. What we're looking at now is really more how to help people on the job site collaborate more effectively to drive efficiencies.
Yeah, no, great, great journey there. So civil engineer by background. I'm a material scientist by background. So I'm always, it's always curious to see how people with engineering backgrounds end up in different roles within the supply chain and logistics industry and different industries, period. Now, you and I have had the opportunity, I've had the opportunity to participate in a couple of your conferences and lead some of the leadership roundtable discussions in terms of moving this industry forward from a digital transformation standpoint. And, one of the things that was fascinating for me is, I think a lot of folks, when they think about supply chain logistics, they tend to think about, consumer goods, retail, automotive, so on and so forth. And this is a supply chain that perhaps is not as visible to many folks in terms of understanding how the supply chain works. So why don't we start there? I mean, why don't you share a little bit about, the construction materials, supply chain? I mean, how is it the same as other supply chains? And I guess more importantly, how is it different?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adrian. I mean, I would say until recently, especially when you think about concrete, asphalt, things like that, things that have a very short shelf life, an hour and a half, something like that. An industry that's highly reactive and lots of inventory turns during a day. Probably our thinking as an industry is, well, why do we need to manage the supply chain? It's that's for people who are dealing with tankers of chemicals coming across oceans and all these things. Why do we need to do it? But actually, as our thinking has evolved, especially my thinking, it's changed because of those issues I just mentioned. You know, when you talk about how construction is the same, I think as we started putting it in the supply chain context, we certainly always have buyers, we certainly always have sellers and logistics providers. And further up in our supply chain, basically that model works. But something that's unique about construction is once you move to the job site, it's different. And what I mean by that is for the most critical work, whether it's the houses we live in, or it's the buildings we work, or the highways and bridges we move around in, we realize that you can't really complete a transaction without inspectors. I mean, and so that's something new in terms of how we think about a supply chain. You can deliver a load of concrete to the site, and you've got a buyer, you've got a seller, you've got that logistics provider. But you don't really complete the transaction until the inspector on the site says, yes, this meets the plastic needs of the material that the owner has specified. And actually, what's even crazier than that is sometimes it's 28 days later when a lab technician comes back and says, well, really, this isn't a good transaction. So we have some uniqueness about how we have to look at things relative to other industries.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, that was one of my takeaways as well. I mean, like you said, I mean, I think when you look at it at a high level, you do have some of those standard parties and transactions that take place, right? There's a buyer, there's a seller, there's an order of some sort. And I think to me, there's just a lot of participants. There's a lot of data and information that needs to be shared between the different participants. So that's another kind of common trait. But I think, to your point, there are extra steps and stakeholders in this process, in this case, kind of inspectors, as you mentioned. I think the other thing, and I think you mentioned this, at the conference, is that when you look at all these projects, they're really make-to-order projects, right? It's not like a mass production type of environment. Every project is different. You're bringing in different suppliers and different stakeholders and different timelines and so on and so forth. So you're really dealing in a make-to-order type of environment and with materials that have a relatively short shelf life, right?
No question. Great point. And, I agree. If I go back to my days before I graduated, I actually co-opted with a major automobile manufacturer. And, you think about it, that world is all about mass production, tasks are specialized. And so it's about doing the same thing over and over and over and better, and incrementally, improving. And over time, if you look at some of the productivity metrics that manufacturing shows, it adds up. It's significant. But, in construction, I've given this some thought, and my guess is there's probably no two projects that are exactly the same, because even if you just happen to have the same designers, the same general contractors, the same subs, the same material suppliers, and you're building the exact same thing, it's going to be on a different plot of land. So that, that's going to be unique. And even if the plots of land are very similar, you're still going to have these different ambient conditions with the weather, which actually has a huge impact on what you're building. So yeah, very unique in that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of those things that, the more you learn about this industry, the more you realize that the complexity involved. And you might tend to think of it as kind of a, hard hat, blue collar, type of supply chain. In many aspects it is, but there's a lot there's a lot of complexity and sophistication that's involved, or should be involved, to get these projects done on time and budget and so forth. Which kind of brings me to kind of the next, my next question. There's talking about the need for transformation, right? I mean, there's just a lot of discussion today across all industries about digital transformation. As it relates to the construction industry, heavy building materials, I mean, why is it so imperative for this industry? Let
me start off at a macro level, if I could. it doesn't matter where you go across the construction industry, whether you're talking with the contractors, whether you're talking with the suppliers, we're resource constrained. I mean, everybody, whether it's people who need haulers to move the materials around, whether it's people on the job site that are placing the materials, we just don't have as many people coming to the industry. You got a lot of them who have a lot of gray hair like me who won't be around it a lot longer, and that's a problem. I mean, if I were to step back and look at it on a global basis, the G20 did a study, and it said that the planned spend for infrastructure over the next 25 years is $79 trillion. That's with a T. A lot of money. But they then go on to say that the actual needed investment is more like $94 trillion. So on a global basis, we've got a $15 trillion gap that somehow we need to find a way to cover over the next 25 years. Now, when I moved closer to home, I think most people understand this intuitively, but the American Society of Civil Engineers for probably 30 years have been giving the country a grade on its infrastructure. And it's gotten progressively worse. And anybody who works in the big cities and has to traverse, it's easily understood. And actually today, the overall grade is like a D plus. For the greatest country in the world, that's probably not acceptable. And so if you just think about the US and the spending we need to have to maintain our productivity as a country, I think the number was something like $4.6 trillion that's needed by 2025, and only 3.6 of that is funded. So again, just here in a shorter period of time in the US, we've got a $2 trillion gap. And I don't think we're going to raise taxes or find other means. It's not going to magically appear. We're going to have to find productivity.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think that's a challenge, across all industries, in terms of the labor, shortage problem. But from a productivity standpoint, I mean, I've seen statistics where, you've seen the improvement in manufacturing productivity over the past, decade or 2 decades. And that's been improving, at a nice clip. But you look at it in the construction industry and it's been relatively flat, not improving at all. So I think it's, how do you bend that curve, right? How do you start getting that, productivity improvements? And I think part of it is, if you actually look around, and I know this is something that I've heard at your conferences, there's just a lot of manual, paper-based, activities that are just still happening, today. I mean, so kind of moving away from that has got to be kind of one of the key areas, or a starting point, right?
Yeah, no question. Look, to your point, and you heard it at the industry, but there was a study, I think it was McKinsey, and they looked at 22 different industries. And of those 22, in terms of digitization, that's basically what they were trying to grade each of the industries on. And out of the 22, they put construction at number 21. So the good news is there's a lot of upside there. To your point about paper, I actually saw an article that came across yesterday. And it just had one sentence which really spoke to me, but it said, we are a document-driven industry, and we need to move to a data-driven industry. And, in support of that, I'm throwing out a lot of numbers, but it just kind of frames how big the issue is. There was a recent study out, I think it was FMI and PlanGrid put out. And it was talking about productivity and waste and things of that nature for the construction industry as a whole. And Adrian, they actually put together a number that said, in the US, the cost of poor data sharing and communication was $31 billion to the industry in and of itself. And not all of that, is tied directly to heavy building materials, but it's just a huge number, and it reinforces that high upside that we speak to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know one of the things that from your presentation at the conference that stuck in my head was when you kind of did that, behind the napkin, calculation of the number of hours spent, taking information that's, on paper and kind of keying them in. And if you kind of, I forget the number you came up with, but it was an astonishing number of wasted labor hours, if you will, just keying in information, which obviously, a lot of that information is going to get keyed in, or an unacceptable amount is going to be inaccurate just because we're human, and we're going to make mistakes. And then that has its own, impact on cost and productivity and quality and so forth. So anyway, I think that was another key, insight for me, just the amount of time and labor that's spent, just keying in data.
Yeah, great point. I mean, uh, this will surprise some people, but the Federal Highway Administration, our government, is actually driving an e-construction initiative. And they're doing it through this program they call Everyday Counts. And certain of the DOTs actually claim to be 98 to 99% paper free on the job site. But the missing piece, and it's what you're really referring to, is this paper delivery ticket that our industry uses. So it's kind of funny and we make fun of it, but all of the suppliers have these digitized systems at their scales or the points where they're batching the materials. And we actually, undigitize that data and put it on paper. And, to kind of give you some of those numbers, there's about 1 million loads of heavy building materials, those products we mentioned earlier, that are moved around the industry every day. And while in some cases we've talked to producers that have these paper tickets that are so problematic, and they actually have 7 or 8 copies that get passed around the job site. But if we just assume there's only 3 recipients of those million, so and then you say, okay, let's be very conservative and say it only takes 3 minutes to rekey the data, and that 1 to 3% data entry error rate. Well, all those are very conservative numbers, but it's shocking that alone with those conservative estimates add up to about 200,000 avoidable work hours per day. You annualize it, and all of a sudden you're looking, at, golly, what was it? 500 million hours per year that the industry spends passing paper around. My guess is we're low by a factor of 2 or 3 based off conversations, and we didn't even put dollars to it yet. So yeah, it's a big problem. In our estimation, it's a problem worth solving. And we think that the first step in the digital transformation, moving us off that number 21 spot, is helping people to digitally collaborate by removing the paper, taking advantage of the technology that's available today.
Right. So I think that's a great point. Tying it back to that $15 trillion gap that you talked about. I mean, you can see how addressing all those wasted labor hours can start chipping away at at that $15 trillion gap. So really, so the starting point, really starting look around and identify those areas where there's a lot of manual processing, paper-based processing, and how can you leverage technology? How can you streamline the processes, perhaps to get rid of some of that duplication and so forth? Certainly I think is a great starting point, and obviously technology plays an important role here. I mean, can you share with us some of the innovations that are making this transformation easier and more possible today?
Yeah, and let me do one thing first, and you probably saw me do this at the conference as well. I don't want to make light of our industry. There's a lot of really smart, hardworking people that are very good at what they do. There's a reason that construction is behind manufacturing in other industries. And I think this is kind of a nuance that may be lost on people, but these other industries, they've been connected to their systems and had access to them for a long time. I mean, going back to my days with the automobile maker, somebody pulls up a truck, you offload the materials, you go to your system, you do the goods receipting in real time, and everybody gets that signal. Quite frankly, the construction industry hasn't had that luxury. I mean, there's a reason that we undigitized it and put it on paper, because we were untethered from our systems. We're out in the middle of a field somewhere, where you got bulldozers and excavators and maybe a little bit of gravel. And, you didn't have the ability to turn to your system and, receive that load of aggregates or asphalt or whatever it may be. So certainly technology is enabling that today, and where it wasn't there not all that long ago. I think it probably starts with mobile technology. Almost everyone has a smartphone or a tablet today, whether it's personal or whether the company provides it. Connectivity is ubiquitous. And, you got to believe if what I read about 5G coming down the pike, it's only going to get more robust. Certainly the lower cost to store and share data has helped. And I mean, probably obvious to most, but I mean, the mobile devices we have, they have many more capabilities today. And that as designers think much more about the user experience and how they help the users consume it. All these things are converging. And so when you take all of it holistically, the paper's got to go away. The next generation, that's all they know. And so, when they graduate college, I mean, the iPhone's been around, 10 years? They've been looking at it for 10 years. They expect things instantaneously. They graduate college, they come to work for our companies, and they see us pass paper around to complete these transactions on the job site. They have to think we're cavemen. And, so we've got to start taking advantage of it. And quite frankly, the next generation is going to drive it, but we should for the productivity we spoke.
That's a great point, because I think if we were having this conversation, let's say, like you said, let's say 10 years ago, even if we identified the problem and the opportunities and the challenges, the reality was that, the technology really wasn't there to fully enable it, right? Because, the mobile technology capabilities weren't as robust or as cost effective as they are today. You didn't have that ubiquitous, connectivity. Certainly cloud applications were just getting started. All these, developments that have taken place over the past 2 decades have really created the opportunity, to your point, where today, really the key enablers are there, right? So now really it's not a question of, hey, we really don't have, the underlying capabilities to move forward with this. They're really there today because of the fast advancements with with technology. And I think you brought up a great point, which I think, certainly, you forget to, you don't think about when you think about other industries. You're right. You're at a warehouse, or you're at a facility that has, mainframe or desktops or RF guns and so forth. So you've got that whole infrastructure. When you're dealing with construction, you're out in the middle of nowhere a lot of the times, and you're out in a very, outdoor environment. Perhaps no fixed address yet, and so forth. So you're really working in an environment that's very different than, what other supply chains are used to or need. So kind of I think the mobile piece, to your point, I think the mobile piece is critical. And the fact that we're now at that stage where these devices and these mobile apps are available is going to be it's going to help accelerate, the opportunities that we've just talked about here. So let's talk a little bit about, some of the success stories or benefits that companies that are started moving, down this transformation journey have started to achieve. Can you share some examples?
Yeah. I've, 3 come to top of mind, Adrian, and I'll talk about it because it kind of demonstrates the value across all the participants. So we mentioned DOTs earlier. So one of the things they've done, they've already been able to track a return on their investment from their early e-construction initiative. So we don't have the paper ticket yet, but it's certainly moving there. But in general, they're finding somewhere between a 200% and 700% return on investment, moving away from paper to digitizing the construction process. So there's no question anybody would make that type of investment with that sort of return. So they're going to drive it. They are driving it, and others will hop on. I think the next trading partner industry segment, I guess is a more correct term, that I would think about would be the contractors. So we've seen examples where contractors have used some of this technology to digitally collaborate, where they're able to save in the neighborhood of 3 to 4% of their budget for construction materials and trucking. Now, to frame that for you, I mean, say on a big, $1 billion project, um, maybe 35% of that is materials. So when you're talking saving 3% of, $350 million, it's not chump change. And, they're doing it by things, they're getting improved yields. They're able to get early payment incentives, which is actually good for both sides of the transaction because, if the contractors can pay in 10 days to achieve 0.5%, if the suppliers offered that, then obviously that's good for them as well. So benefit that comes out there, and not to mention the reduced handling cost of managing the paper and just having visibility of the entire supply chain. So significant savings for DOTs and contractors. And, this may surprise some people, but one of the more interesting stories was the third-party haulers. And so, one of the things that's traditionally happened in our industry is that, because of the high inventory turns, the ready mix producers, for example, have always said, just keep my silos full, keep them up at to the top. And we don't care, come as often as you need. And as a matter of fact, why don't you show up first thing in the morning? Well, if you're a hauler who's starving to get drivers, having a guy sitting in rush hour traffic trying to get to your plant doesn't make sense, especially when the driver gets there and finds out that there's not room in the silo to take the shipment. So think of all the waste just involved there. So one of our industry participants told a story that by giving them visibility to understand, number one, what is the inventory in the silo? Number two, what is the demand over the next few hours? It allows them to use their assets more effectively to go somewhere where maybe the demand's greater, it's going against traffic. So there's all these hidden second order effects that, managing this digitally can provide to all the participants.
Yeah, no, those are all great examples, and the last example was something that caught my eye because when I heard that story, that success story, I really equated it to vendor managed inventory, right? It was a good kind of, which is VMI, to our early discussion, it's kind of common in, let's say, the automotive industry. It's been around in a proven model, but it's relatively new in this industry, right? Because of the things you need to enable, the amount of trust that you need to then have between the trading partners to let someone like the hauler really, have the orchestrate that whole process in terms of have visibility to the inventory, have visibility to the production plans, and then be able to, define and determine the best, the amount and frequency to do those replenishments. But I think that story, really showed the benefits, how it was really a win-win-win story for the hauler. In this case, it was the cement supplier and the ready mix plant. How they all got benefits around having that increased visibility and orchestration taking place between the three parties. So I thought that was a great example there. Steve, but we're running short on time here. So just as a way to wrap up, I mean, what questions should companies in the industry ask themselves then to assess where they are today, relative to digital transformation, and what actions they should take moving forward?
Yeah, good, great question. Look, I think at first, probably the first questions they should ask should be around the resource challenges we talked about on a couple occasions. Can they envision a world where this is going to improve anytime soon? And I think if they're honest with themselves, the answer is no. And so the question becomes is how can we drive productivity and where will it come from? Now, as also mentioned, there's a lot of really smart people in the industry. They've run good businesses for a long time. And so I think one of the things is a lot of them are probably tapped out in terms of the internal productivity they can capture within their own operations, within their own companies. And so, going back to this theme that we started out with earlier, that's why I believe digital collaboration and the example you just gave of vendor managed inventory is so important. And there was a definition we came across for digital collaboration, and there's probably thousands or millions of them out there. But it basically said digital collaboration connects a broader network of participants who can accomplish much more than they would on their own. And that really spoke to me because I believe that, there's a lot of really good people in our industry. They believe in relationships, they invest in relationships. And if they trust each other to share this information, improve the visibility, there's a lot of value to be gained in doing so. And so kind of the last part to your question is, well, how do they start? I'm going to steal one of your quotes, actually. I heard you say it because I like it so much, but it was a Mark Twain quote. It said, the first step to getting ahead is getting started, if I remember it properly. And so I think that really applies here. This isn't going to happen overnight. My recommendation to people in the industry is start small. Find the right people in your own organizations, people that are passionate about it, people that want to make it happen. Pick the right trading partners. Not all trading partners are going to be ready. And so find the ones where you can. Make sure you have the right technology partners. And when you get together and you start, celebrate the wins. There's always going to be more to be done, but celebrate the wins. Don't get focused on all the stuff that you have to do. Celebrate what you've got and then build upon them. And, I guess kind of just my last thought. There's no question in my mind that this digital collaboration we're speaking to is going to happen. Just like it just seems like yesterday that the floppy disk in Windows was coming out in my career. I suspect we're going to be amazed at how quick digital collaboration on the job site is in place and operating, because there's just so much value to our industry. There's a need for it. And quite frankly, it only makes sense.
Well, Steve, great insights and advice, and I think you're spot on. I agree as well. I think that there's going to be a lot of positive change taking place in the industry, in the months and few years ahead. So, thank you again. I always say, we always manage to just scratch the surface on these topics, but you provided some great food for thought and insights and advice to get the get some action started on this journey. So again, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Adrian. Have a great day.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Command Alkon website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Steve, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.